The clock on the wall showed 11:47 p.m. when Amy Coney Barrett finally looked up from the stack of papers on her desk. The Supreme Court building was quiet at this hour, with only the night security guard making his rounds through the empty hallways. But Barrett couldn't sleep. Not tonight. Not after what she had discovered. Earlier that day, she had been reviewing routine legal documents when something caught her eye. It was a small detail, the kind that most people would miss. But Barrett had spent years studying constitutional law, and her trained eye spotted problems that others couldn't see. The paperwork related to Karoline Leavitt's appointment as White House press secretary contained what Barrett believed were serious procedural errors. Barrett pushed her reading, glasses up her nose, and read through the documents again. The more she studied them, the more concerned she became. According to her understanding of the Constitution, certain steps had been skipped during Leavitt's appointment process. These weren't small mistakes. In Barrett's mind, they were violations of the fundamental rules that govern how the American government operates. She stood up and walked to the large window that overlooked the nation's capital. The lights of Washington, D.C. twinkled in the darkness below. Barrett had always taken her job seriously, but tonight felt different. She believed she was facing a constitutional crisis, and she was the only one who seemed to notice it. The next morning, Barrett arrived at her office earlier than usual. She had barely slept, her mind racing with thoughts about what she should do. Her law clerks, the young lawyers who helped her with research and writing, noticed something was different about their boss. She seemed more focused, more intense than usual. Barrett called her senior law clerk into her office. The young man, fresh out of Harvard Law School, had worked for Barrett for 2 years and had never seen her look so serious. "I need you to research something for me," Barrett said, sliding a folder across her desk. "I want you to look into the constitutional requirements for appointing a White House press secretary. Check everything. The Founding Fathers' writings, previous court cases, historical precedents, everything." The law clerk nodded and took the folder. He had learned not to ask too many questions when Barrett gave him research assignments. She always had her reasons, and they were usually good ones. Over the next few days, Barrett threw herself into the research. She spent hours reading through old Supreme Court cases, studying the Constitution word by word, and examining the historical records of how previous press secretaries had been appointed. The more she researched, the more convinced she became that something was seriously wrong with Leavitt's appointment. Barrett's colleagues began to notice her unusual behavior. During their weekly lunch meetings, she seemed distracted. In court, she asked more pointed questions than usual. Justice Clarence Thomas, who sat next to her on the bench, asked if everything was okay. "I'm fine," Barrett replied, but Thomas could tell she wasn't being completely honest. The truth was, Barrett was struggling with a decision that could change everything. She had discovered what she believed was a clear violation of constitutional procedure, but acting on it would be unprecedented. No Supreme Court justice had ever tried to directly challenge the appointment of a White House staff member. It would break new ground in a way that might cause serious problems between the different branches of government. Barrett knew that the Supreme Court was supposed to stay out of executive branch business unless a case was brought before them through the proper legal channels. But what if the executive branch was violating the Constitution and no one else was willing to speak up? Did she have a duty to act, even if it meant stepping outside the normal boundaries of her job? Late one evening, Barrett sat in her home study, surrounded by law books and legal documents. Her family was asleep upstairs, but she couldn't rest. She kept thinking about the oath she had taken when she became a Supreme Court justice. She had promised to defend the Constitution against all enemies, foreign and domestic. But what if the threat to the Constitution was coming from within the government itself? Barrett picked up her phone and called her most trusted advisor, a constitutional law professor who had been her mentor in law school. Even though it was late, she needed someone to talk through her concerns. "I think I've found a serious constitutional problem," she told her mentor. "But addressing it would require me to do something that's never been done before." Her mentor listened carefully as Barrett explained her findings. When she finished, there was a long silence on the other end of the phone. "Amy," her mentor finally said, "you need to be very careful here. What you're describing could cause a major crisis between the Supreme Court and the White House. Are you absolutely certain about your legal analysis? Barrett had been asking herself the same question for days. She had checked and double-checked her research. She had consulted multiple sources and examined the issue from every possible angle. In her professional opinion, there was no doubt that constitutional procedures had been violated. The next morning, Barrett made her decision. She would reach out to the White House through official channels and request a meeting to discuss what she called matters of constitutional significance. She wouldn't make any public statements or cause any drama. She would simply try to address the issue quietly and professionally. Barrett drafted a formal letter on Supreme Court letterhead. She chose her words carefully, making sure to be respectful but firm. The letter explained that she had identified potential constitutional concerns related to a recent executive branch appointment and requested a private meeting to discuss the matter. She sealed the letter in an official envelope and personally delivered it to the court's mailroom, with instructions that it be sent immediately to the White House counsel's office. As she walked back to her chambers, Barrett felt a mixture of relief and anxiety. She had taken the first step down a path that no Supreme Court justice had ever walked before. Over the next few days, Barrett waited for a response. She checked her mail and email constantly, expecting to hear back from the White House at any moment. Surely they would want to address her concerns quickly and quietly. After all, if there really was a constitutional problem, it would be in everyone's interest to fix it as soon as possible. But days passed and no response came. Barrett began to worry that her letter had gotten lost or forgotten in the massive White House bureaucracy. She decided to follow up with a phone call to the White House counsel's office. The conversation was brief and frustrating. The person who answered the phone claimed to have no knowledge of Barrett's letter and seemed reluctant to discuss the matter further. They promised to look into it and get back to her, but Barrett could tell she wasn't being taken seriously. As the week wore on, Barrett's frustration grew. She had identified what she believed was a serious constitutional violation, and the White House seemed to be ignoring her completely. She began to wonder if she should take more direct action. Barrett's law clerks noticed that their boss was becoming increasingly agitated. She snapped at them over minor mistakes and seemed unable to concentrate on her regular judicial duties. One evening, after everyone else had gone home, Barrett sat alone in her office and tried to figure out what to do next. She had always believed that the American system of government worked because different branches kept each other in check. The Supreme Court was supposed to make sure that the other branches followed the Constitution. But what happened when one branch simply refused to listen? Barrett realized that she was facing a test of everything she believed about the law and the Constitution. She could back down and let the potential violation go unchallenged, or she could continue pushing forward into uncharted territory. Either choice carried serious risks. As she sat in her quiet office, surrounded by the weight of legal tradition and constitutional responsibility, Barrett made a decision that would set in motion a chain of events unlike anything in American political history. She would not back down. She would continue fighting for what she believed was right, no matter what the consequences might be. The stage was set for an unprecedented confrontation between the highest court in the land and the executive branch of government. Barrett had taken the first step, and there was no turning back now. 2 weeks had passed since Barrett sent her letter to the White House, and still no response. Every morning she would arrive at her office hoping to find a message waiting for her, but her inbox remained disappointingly empty. The silence was starting to eat away at her confidence. Barrett sat at her desk, staring at a blank piece of paper. She had been trying to write for an hour, but the words wouldn't come. How do you politely demand that the most powerful office in the country pay attention to you? How do you make them understand that this isn't just some minor legal disagreement? Her senior law clerk knocked on the door and peeked his head inside. Justice Barrett, you have that meeting with Justice Roberts in 10 minutes. Barrett looked up, startled. She had completely forgotten about her appointment with the Chief Justice. Thank you, she said, quickly gathering her papers. I'll be right there. As she walked down the hallway to Robert's office, Barrett felt her stomach tighten with nervous energy. She hadn't told anyone about her investigation into Leavitt's appointment. But Roberts had a way of sensing when something was bothering his fellow justices. She would have to be careful about what she said. Chief Justice John Roberts was sitting behind his large wooden desk when Barrett knocked on his door. He looked up from the document he was reading and smiled warmly. "Amy, come in. How are things going?" "Fine," Barrett replied, though she knew her voice didn't sound convincing. She sat down in the chair across from his desk, trying to appear relaxed. Roberts studied her face for a moment. He had been Chief Justice for almost 2 decades, and he had learned to read people well. "You seem distracted lately. Is everything okay at home? The kids doing well?" Barrett nodded. "Everyone's fine, just been working on some complicated research, that's all." "Anything I can help with?" Roberts asked. His tone was casual, but Barrett could tell he was genuinely concerned. For a moment, Barrett considered telling him everything. Roberts was not just her boss, he was also someone she respected and trusted. Maybe he could give her advice on how to handle the situation. But something held her back. She wasn't ready to reveal her hand yet. "It's probably nothing," she said, "just trying to make sure I understand some constitutional questions that might come up in future cases." Roberts nodded, but Barrett could tell he wasn't entirely satisfied with her answer. They talked for a few more minutes about routine court business, and then Barrett excused herself to return to her office. That afternoon, Barrett made a decision. If the White House wasn't going to respond to a polite letter, maybe they would take notice of something more official. She spent the rest of the day drafting a formal legal memorandum that outlined her constitutional concerns in detail. The memorandum was 12 pages long and filled with citations from legal cases, historical documents, and constitutional scholars. Barrett wrote it in the careful, precise language that lawyers use when they want to make sure there's no room for misunderstanding. She explained exactly why she believed Leavitt's appointment violated constitutional procedures and what the consequences might be if the issue wasn't addressed. When she finished writing, Barrett read through the memorandum 3 more times, checking every word and every citation. This document would go through the Chief Justice's office, which meant Roberts would definitely see it. Once she submitted it, there would be no hiding what she was doing. Barrett took a deep breath and walked to Roberts' office. His secretary told her he was in a meeting, so she left the memorandum with a note asking him to review it and forward it to the appropriate White House officials. The next morning, Barrett's phone rang at 7:30 a.m. It was Roberts, and he didn't sound happy. "Amy, we need to talk. My office, 15 minutes. Barrett's heart started racing. She had been expecting this call, but that didn't make it any less nerve-wracking. She quickly got dressed and drove to the Supreme Court building, her mind racing with possible explanations for what she had done. Roberts was waiting for her when she arrived. He was holding her memorandum in his hand, and his expression was serious. "Amy, what is this?" he asked, waving the document in the air. "Are you really trying to challenge the appointment of a White House staff member?" Barrett sat down and tried to keep her voice steady. "John, I believe there are serious constitutional issues that need to be addressed. I've done extensive research, and I'm convinced that proper procedures weren't followed." Roberts leaned back in his chair and rubbed his temples. "Do you have any idea what you're asking me to do? You want me to send an official Supreme Court memorandum to the White House questioning their personnel decisions. This is completely unprecedented." "Sometimes unprecedented action is necessary to protect the Constitution," Barrett replied. "Isn't that what we swore to do when we took this job?" For the next hour, Roberts and Barrett had one of the most intense conversations of their professional relationship. Roberts argued that the Supreme Court should stay out of executive branch personnel matters unless a case was brought before them through proper legal channels. Barrett countered that they had a duty to speak up when they witnessed clear constitutional violations. Finally, Roberts agreed to forward the memorandum to the White House, but he made it clear that he wasn't endorsing Barrett's position. "I'm doing this because you're my colleague and I respect your legal judgment," he said. "But I want you to know that I think you're making a mistake." Over the next few days, word of Barrett's memorandum began to spread among the other Supreme Court justices. The Supreme Court is a small, tight-knit community, and it's almost impossible to keep secrets for very long. Justice Samuel Alito was the first to approach Barrett directly. He found her in the court's library, surrounded by stacks of legal books. "Heard about your memorandum," he said quietly, sitting down beside her. "I want you to know that I think you're doing the right thing. If we don't stand up for constitutional principles, who will?" Barrett felt a wave of relief wash over her. Having Alito's support meant a lot. He was known for his strong conservative views and his willingness to take controversial positions when he believed they were legally justified. But not all of her colleagues were supportive. Justice Stephen Breyer, one of the more liberal members of the court, cornered her after a court session. "Amy, I'm worried about what you're doing," he said. "I understand your constitutional concerns, but I think you're going about this the wrong way. The Supreme Court's power comes from our reputation for being above political fights. If we start involving ourselves in executive branch personnel decisions, we risk losing that reputation." Barrett listened respectfully to Breyer's concerns, but she wasn't swayed by his arguments. "Stephen, this isn't about politics," she replied. "This is about the Constitution. Sometimes we have to risk our reputation to do what's right." As the days turned into weeks, Barrett found herself becoming increasingly isolated. Some of her colleagues supported her privately, but were unwilling to say so publicly. Others openly criticized her approach. The atmosphere in the Supreme Court building became tense and uncomfortable. Meanwhile, Barrett was still waiting for some kind of response from the White House. Roberts had confirmed that her memorandum had been delivered to the White House counsel's office, but there had been no acknowledgement that it had even been received. Barrett decided to try a different approach. She reached out to several prominent constitutional law professors who she had known since her days in academia. Maybe they could help her build support for her position or suggest alternative ways to address the issue. The responses she received were mixed. Some professors agreed with her legal analysis and praised her for taking a principled stand. Others warned her that she was overstepping the traditional boundaries of judicial authority. One professor, who had been Barrett's mentor when she was teaching law school, called her on the phone to discuss the situation. "Amy, I admire your commitment to constitutional principles," he said. "But I'm concerned that you're fighting a battle you can't win. The White House has no legal obligation to respond to your concerns unless a case comes before the Supreme Court through normal channels. By trying to force the issue this way, you might actually weaken the court's authority in the long run." Barrett had been hearing similar warnings from multiple sources, but she wasn't ready to give up. She had invested too much time and energy in this fight to back down now. Besides, she genuinely believed that she was right about the constitutional issues involved. As another week passed without any response from the White House, Barrett began to consider more drastic measures. Maybe it was time to take her concerns public. She could write an opinion piece for a major newspaper or give an interview to a respected legal publication. But even as she considered these options, Barrett knew they would represent a major escalation in her conflict with the executive branch. Once she went public with her concerns, there would be no way to resolve the issue quietly. The entire country would be watching to see how the confrontation played out. Barrett spent a sleepless night, weighing her options. She walked around her house unable to sit still as she tried to figure out what to do next. Her family was asleep, but she felt more alone than she had ever felt in her professional life. The next morning, Barrett arrived at her office with a new sense of determination. She had decided that she couldn't let the White House ignore her concerns indefinitely. If they wouldn't respond to polite requests and formal memorandums, maybe it was time to try a more direct approach. Barrett picked up her phone and dialed the number for the White House counsel's office. When someone answered, she identified herself and asked to speak with the White House counsel directly. "I'm sorry, Justice Barrett," the voice on the other end said, "but the counsel is in meetings all day. Can I take a message?" Barrett felt her frustration boiling over. "Yes, you can take a message," she said, trying to keep her voice professional. "Tell him that I've been trying to discuss important constitutional matters with his office for over a month, and I haven't received so much as an acknowledgement. This is unacceptable." The person on the phone promised to pass along the message, but Barrett could tell that nothing would come of it. The White House had made their strategy clear. They were going to ignore her completely, hoping that she would eventually give up and go away. But Barrett had no intention of giving up. As she hung up the phone, she realized that the White House's silence was actually making her more determined than ever to find a way to force them to address her concerns. The battle was just beginning. Barrett woke up on Monday morning to the sound of her alarm clock, but she had already been awake for hours. Sleep had become impossible. Every night she would lie in bed thinking about the White House's complete silence. It had been 6 weeks since her first letter, 3 weeks since her formal memorandum, and still nothing. Not even a simple acknowledgement that they had received her communications. She got dressed and drove to work, listening to the morning news on the radio. The reporter was talking about the daily White House press briefing that would happen later. That day, Barrett's hands tightened on the steering wheel when she heard Karoline Leavitt's name mentioned. Press Secretary Leavitt will address questions about the president's upcoming trip to California, the reporter said. Barrett turned off the radio in frustration. Here was Leavitt, going about her daily business as if nothing was wrong, while Barrett's constitutional concerns were being completely ignored. When Barrett arrived at the Supreme Court building, she noticed that some of her law clerks were whispering among themselves and stopped talking when she walked by. Word about her conflict with the White House was spreading, and people were starting to take sides. Barrett called her senior law clerk into her office. The young man looked nervous as he sat down across from her desk. "I need you to do something. For me," Barrett said. "I want you to watch today's White House press briefing and take notes on everything Press Secretary Leavitt says and does. Pay attention to how she handles questions, what authority she claims to have, and whether she makes any statements that relate to constitutional issues." The law clerk nodded, but Barrett could see the concern in his eyes. "Justice Barrett, if you don't mind me asking, why are we monitoring White House press briefings? That seems like something outside our normal duties." Barrett paused. She had been asking her staff to do increasingly unusual tasks, and she could tell they were starting to worry about her judgment. "I'm conducting research into the constitutional limits of executive branch communications," she said. It wasn't entirely untrue, but it wasn't the whole truth either. Later that morning, Barrett received an unexpected visitor. Justice Clarence Thomas knocked on her door and asked if he could come in for a private conversation. "Amy, I've been hearing things," Thomas said as he settled into a chair. "People are saying you're trying to challenge the White House over some personnel matter. Is that true?" Barrett had always respected Thomas. He was one of the most conservative justices on the court, and she valued his opinion. She decided to be honest with him about what she was doing. "Clarence, I've discovered what I believe are serious constitutional violations in how Karoline Leavitt was appointed as press secretary. I've tried to address this quietly through official channels, but the White House is completely ignoring me." Thomas listened carefully as Barrett explained her legal reasoning and described her attempts to get the White House's attention. When she finished, he was quiet for a long moment. "Amy, I understand your concerns and I respect your commitment to constitutional principles," he finally said, "but I have to ask you something. Are you absolutely certain that this is the hill you want to die on? Because that's what you're doing. You're putting your reputation and the court's reputation on the line for something that might not be as clear-cut as you think it is." Barrett felt a flash of anger. "Clarence, are you saying that I'm wrong about the constitutional issues?" "I'm saying that constitutional law isn't always black and white," Thomas replied. "Even if you're technically correct about the procedural violations, that doesn't mean the Supreme Court should involve itself in executive branch personnel decisions. We have to pick our battles carefully." After Thomas left, Barrett sat alone in her office feeling more isolated than ever. Even her most conservative colleague was questioning her judgment. She began to wonder if everyone else could see something that she was missing. That afternoon, Barrett watched a recording of Leavitt's press briefing. She took careful notes as Leavitt answered questions from reporters, looking for any sign that the White House was aware of Barrett's concerns. But Leavitt seemed completely unaware that her position was being challenged by a Supreme Court justice. She spoke with confidence and authority, as if her appointment was completely legitimate and uncontroversial. Barrett found Leavitt's confidence infuriating. How could she act so assured when there were serious questions about whether she had been properly appointed? Barrett paused the video and stared at Leavitt's face on her computer screen. The young woman looked poised and professional, completely unbothered by constitutional concerns that were keeping Barrett awake at night. The next day, Barrett decided to try a different approach. She had been working through official channels, but maybe she needed to reach out to people who had personal connections to the White House. She spent the morning making phone calls to lawyers and professors who she thought might have influence with the administration. The conversations were frustrating and disappointing. Most of the people she called were polite, but clearly unwilling to get involved. Some claimed they didn't have any real influence with the White House. Others suggested that Barrett was overreacting to what they saw as minor procedural issues. One conversation particularly bothered Barrett. She called a prominent lawyer who had worked in previous Republican administrations and who she thought would understand her concerns. "Amy, I've heard rumors about what you're doing," the lawyer said. "Can I give you some friendly advice? Drop this. You're fighting a battle you can't win, and you're going to damage your reputation in the process. The White House has made it clear that they're not going to engage with you on this issue. Take the hint and move on." Barrett hung up the phone feeling angry and frustrated. Everyone seemed to think she should just give up and accept the constitutional violation. But she couldn't do that. She had taken an oath to defend the Constitution, and that oath meant something to her. As the days went by, Barrett began to notice changes in how people treated her. Some of her colleagues seemed to avoid her in the hallways. Court staff members were more formal and distant than usual. She overheard snippets of conversations that stopped abruptly when people realized she was nearby. The tension came to a head during the Justices' weekly conference meeting. These meetings were supposed to be private discussions about pending cases, but Barrett could tell that her colleagues wanted to talk about her White House situation. Finally, Justice Elena Kagan brought up the issue directly. "Amy, I think we need to discuss what's been happening with your research project. It's starting to affect the entire court." Barrett felt all eyes on her as she tried to maintain her composure. "I don't think my constitutional research is anyone else's concern," she said. "It becomes our concern when it affects the court's reputation," Chief Justice Roberts interjected. "Amy, I've been getting calls from legal reporters asking about your conflict with the White House. This isn't staying quiet anymore." Barrett's heart sank. She had hoped to keep her efforts private until she could find a way to force the White House to respond. But it seemed like word was leaking out to the press. "What exactly are people saying?" Barrett asked. "They're saying that you're trying to interfere with executive branch personnel decisions," Justice Breyer replied. "They're portraying it as judicial overreach." Barrett spent the rest of the meeting defending her actions, but she could tell that most of her colleagues were not convinced. By the time the meeting ended, she felt completely alone. That evening, Barrett sat in her home office trying to figure out what to do next. She had tried official letters, formal memorandums, phone calls, and personal appeals. Nothing had worked. The White House's strategy of complete silence was proving to be remarkably effective. Barrett realized that she was facing a fundamental problem with the American system of government. The Supreme Court's power ultimately depended on other branches of government respecting their authority. But what happened when one branch simply refused to acknowledge that authority? What happened when they just ignored the Supreme Court completely? She pulled out a legal pad and began writing down her options. She could go public with her concerns, but that would escalate the conflict to a level that might damage the Supreme Court's reputation. She could try to get other justices to join her cause, but it was clear that most of them thought she was making a mistake. She could file an official Supreme Court opinion, but that would be unprecedented and might be seen as a dangerous power grab. As Barrett stared at her list of options, she realized that none of them were good. Each choice carried serious risks, and there was no guarantee that any of them would actually force the White House to address her concerns. Her phone rang, interrupting her thoughts. It was her former law professor, the one who had been advising her throughout this process. "Amy, I just heard from a friend at the Washington Post," he said. "They're working on a story about your conflict with the White House. It's going to be published tomorrow." Barrett felt her stomach drop. "What are they saying?" "The headline is going to be something like Supreme Court Justice Attempts to Interfere with White House Personnel. They're portraying you as overstepping your authority." After hanging up the phone, Barrett realized that her private battle with the White House was about to become very public. Once the story was published, there would be no going back. The entire country would be watching to see how the conflict played out. Barrett walked to her window and looked out at the lights of Washington, D.C. Somewhere out there, Karoline Leavitt was probably preparing for tomorrow's press briefing, still completely unaware of the constitutional storm that was brewing around. Her position. The White House's strategy of silence had worked perfectly. They had avoided engaging with Barrett's concerns while allowing her to look like the aggressor. As Barrett stood at her window, she realized that she had been outmaneuvered. The White House hadn't just ignored her concerns, they had turned her constitutional advocacy into a story about judicial overreach. Tomorrow, when the newspaper story was published, she would have to decide whether to continue fighting or to retreat and try to save what was left of her reputation. The silence from the White House had been deafening, but Barrett was about to discover that sometimes silence could be the most powerful response of all. Barrett didn't sleep at all that night. She sat in her kitchen with a cup of coffee, watching the clock slowly tick toward morning. At 6 a.m., she heard the thud of the newspaper hitting her front door. She walked outside in her bathrobe and picked up the Washington Post, her hands shaking slightly as she unfolded it. The headline was even worse than she had expected. Supreme Court Justice wages unprecedented campaign against White House staff member. Below it was a large photo of Barrett from her confirmation hearings, and next to it, a smaller photo of Karoline Leavitt at the press podium. Barrett read the article with growing horror. The reporter had talked to several unnamed sources who described her efforts as judicial interference and an unprecedented breach of separation of powers. One quote particularly stung. Justice Barrett seems to have forgotten that the Supreme Court is supposed to interpret laws, not dictate personnel decisions to the executive branch. The article mentioned her letters, her formal memorandum, and her phone calls to the White House. Someone had leaked details about her private conversations with fellow justices. The story made her look like someone who had lost perspective and was trying to grab power that didn't belong to her. Barrett's phone started ringing at 6:30 a.m. The first call was from Chief Justice Roberts. "Amy, we need to talk." "My office." 1 hour. The drive to the Supreme Court building felt like the longest trip of Barrett's life. She kept the radio off because she didn't want to hear what the morning news shows were saying about her. When she arrived at the court, she noticed that there were more reporters than usual gathered outside the building. Roberts was waiting for her with a copy of the newspaper spread out on his desk. His expression was grim. "Amy, this has gone too far," he said without any greeting. "The court's reputation is being damaged by your personal crusade. I need you to explain to me right now why you think this fight is worth it." Barrett sat down across from him and tried to organize her thoughts. She had been so focused on the constitutional issues that she hadn't fully considered how her actions would look to the outside world. "John, I genuinely believe that constitutional procedures were violated," she said. "I took an oath to defend the Constitution. How can I just ignore a clear violation?" Roberts leaned forward in his chair. "Amy, even if you're right about the procedural issues, the way you've gone about this has created a bigger problem than the one you were trying to solve. The Supreme Court's power comes from public respect for our authority. When we're seen as political actors trying to interfere with other branches of government, we lose that respect." For the next hour, Roberts and Barrett had the most difficult conversation of their professional relationship. Roberts explained how the morning news shows were already discussing the story and how legal experts were criticizing Barrett's approach. The damage to the court's reputation was spreading quickly. "What do you want me to do?" Barrett finally asked. "I want you to end this," Roberts replied. "Write a statement saying that you're withdrawing your concerns and that you recognize the limits of judicial authority. We need to contain this damage before it gets any worse." Barrett felt like she was being asked to betray everything she believed in. But as she looked at Robert's worried face, she began to understand the position she had put him in. As Chief Justice, his job was to protect the institution of the Supreme Court, even if that meant asking individual justices to back down from fights they believed were important. After leaving Roberts's office, Barrett walked through the halls of the Supreme Court building, feeling like a stranger in her own workplace. Other justices and court staff members avoided eye contact with her. She could hear whispered conversations that stopped when she approached. Barrett's law clerks were waiting for her when she returned to her office. They looked uncomfortable and worried. Justice Barrett, her senior law clerk, said, "We've been getting calls from reporters all morning. They want to know about the research we've been doing on constitutional procedures. What should we tell them?" Barrett realized that her staff was now caught up in the controversy. These young lawyers had promising careers ahead of them, and their association with her failed crusade could hurt their future prospects. "Don't talk to any reporters," she said. "Refer all calls to the court's public information office." That afternoon, Barrett forced herself to watch Karoline Leavitt's daily press briefing. She wanted to see if Leavitt would address the newspaper story or acknowledge the constitutional concerns that had been raised. Leavitt stepped up to the podium looking completely composed and confident. A reporter asked her about the Washington Post article and whether she wanted to respond to Justice Barrett's concerns about her appointment. "I'm not going to comment on the internal processes of other branches of government," Leavitt said smoothly. "I'm focused on doing my job and serving the American people in my role as press secretary." Barrett watched in amazement as Leavitt dismissed the entire controversy with just 2 sentences. There was no defensiveness, no anger, no indication that she was worried about the constitutional questions surrounding her position. She simply treated Barrett's concerns as irrelevant and moved on to the next question. That evening, Barrett sat in her home office trying to write a statement that would end the controversy. She had filled several pages with different approaches, but nothing sounded right. How do you explain that you were trying to defend the Constitution without admitting that you had overstepped your authority? Barrett's husband found her there, at midnight, surrounded by crumpled pieces of paper. "Amy, you need to get some sleep," he said gently. "This will all look different in the morning." "I don't think it will," Barrett replied. "I think I've made a terrible mistake and I don't know how to fix it." Her husband sat down next to her and put his hand on her shoulder. "What would you tell one of our kids if they made a mistake and didn't know how to fix it?" Barrett thought about the question. "I'd tell them to take responsibility for what they did wrong and try to learn from it." "Then maybe that's what you need to do," her husband said. The next morning, Barrett arrived at her office early and began writing what would be the most difficult statement of her career. She wrote about her deep commitment to constitutional principles and her belief that she had identified legitimate procedural concerns. But she also acknowledged that her approach had been inappropriate and had damaged the Supreme Court's reputation. The statement took her most of the day to write. She went through dozens of drafts trying to find the right balance between defending her intentions and accepting responsibility for her mistakes. Finally, she had something that felt honest and appropriate. Barrett called Chief Justice Roberts and read him the statement over the phone. There was a long pause after she finished. "Amy, this is good," Roberts said. "It's honest and it takes responsibility. I think this will help repair some of the damage." The statement was released that afternoon through the Supreme Court's Public Information Office. In it, Barrett explained that she had been conducting research into constitutional procedures and had become concerned about certain issues. However, she acknowledged that her approach had been inappropriate and that she was withdrawing her concerns out of respect for the separation of powers. The news coverage of Barrett's statement was mixed. Some commentators praised her for taking responsibility and backing down from an inappropriate fight. Others criticized her for getting involved in the first place. But most importantly, the story began to fade from the headlines. Over the next few weeks, Barrett tried to return to her normal judicial duties. She worked on pending cases, wrote legal opinions, and participated in court conferences. But she could tell that her relationships with her colleagues had been damaged. The trust and respect that she had built up over years of service had been diminished by her failed crusade. Barrett also noticed that her law clerks were treating her differently. They were still respectful and professional, but there was a new wariness in their interactions with her. They seemed to be questioning her judgment in ways they never had before. One afternoon, Barrett was working in the court's library when Justice Thomas approached her table. "Amy, how are you holding up?" he asked quietly. "I'm fine," Barrett replied. though they both knew that wasn't entirely true. Thomas sat down across from her. I want you to know that I understand why you did what you did. Your constitutional concerns were legitimate, even if your approach was problematic. Sometimes we have to learn hard lessons about the limits of our authority. Barrett felt tears welling up in her eyes. It was the first time in weeks that a colleague had spoken to her with genuine understanding rather than criticism or disappointment. Clarence, do you think I damaged the court's reputation permanently? She asked. The Supreme Court has survived bigger controversies than this, Thomas replied. But it will take time for people to forget what happened. You'll need to be very careful about your actions going forward. Meanwhile, Karoline Leavitt continued her daily press briefings as if nothing had ever happened. She never mentioned Barrett's constitutional concerns or acknowledged that there had been any controversy about her appointment. The White House's strategy of complete silence had worked perfectly. They had allowed Barrett to look like the aggressor, while positioning themselves as the reasonable party that was focused on governing rather than political fights. Barrett realized that she had been outmaneuvered from the very beginning. The White House had understood that the best way to deal with her concerns was simply to ignore them completely. By refusing to engage, they had forced her to escalate her efforts to increasingly inappropriate levels. In the end, she had damaged her own reputation while having no impact whatsoever on the issues she had been trying to address. Months later, Barrett would look back on the episode as one of the most humbling experiences of her career. She had learned that being technically correct about constitutional issues wasn't enough if you couldn't build support for your position. She had also learned that the separation of powers wasn't just a legal principle, it was a practical reality that limited what any one branch of government could accomplish on its own. The failed confrontation with the White House became a reminder to Barrett about the importance of institutional restraint and the dangers of letting personal convictions override professional judgment. She continued to serve on the Supreme Court, but with a new understanding of the delicate balance between constitutional principle and political reality. In the end, both Barrett and Leavitt continued in their respective roles, but the unresolved tension between judicial authority and executive independence lingered as a reminder of how the American system of government really works. Sometimes the most powerful response to a challenge is simply to ignore it completely.